I woke up at night sometimes drenched in sweat because I saw the eyes of my fallen adversary, of the enemy, and I tried to convince myself what would have happened to me if I wouldn't have been quicker than he, what would have happened to me if I wouldn't have thrust my bayonet first into his belly. What was it that we soldiers stabbed each other, strangled each other, went for each other like mad dogs? What was it that we, who had nothing against them personally, fought with them to the very end and death?
They called it the Great War, the war to end all wars. A tragic, inexplicable catastrophe that engulfed a continent. At least, that's the story we've been told. But what if the catastrophe was not an accident? What if the millions of lives lost in the mud of the Somme and the Verdun were not merely pawns in a game of kings and kaisers, but the final, bloody sacrifice on the altar of a dying system? This is not merely a story of nations. This is a story of empire, of capital, and of the machine that devoured a generation to save itself. The powder keg of Europe wasn't just built on ancient rivalries. It was engineered by a new global economic order known as industrial capitalism. By 1914, the great powers of the world, Britain, France, Germany, Russia, had been engaged in a decades-long scramble for colonies, a race to carve up the globe at the expense of life in the global south. This was not for glory, but for resources, rubber, cotton, minerals, and most of all, new markets for their goods and new fields for their investors. The system demanded infinite growth on a finite planet. The result was a world of empires, each a pyramid of exploitation, with the colonies at the bottom and the financiers and industrialists at the top. This is the highest stage of capitalism, imperialism. The monopolies and finance capital that dominated economic life had an insatiable hunger for super profits, leading to the economic partition of the world and inevitably to war over its repartition. So when Archduke Franz Ferdinand was shot, the gears of this machine began to turn. The system had reached its logical conclusion. The treaties and alliances were not just political doctrines, they were cartel agreements of competing capitalist blocs. The so-called national interest was a myth, a story told to the working classes who would be doing the dying. The socialist thinker Rosa Luxemburg saw it clearly. She posited that capitalism, to survive, must constantly expand into non-capitalist territories, the colonies, the pre-industrialized world. Once that world was fully consumed, the system would turn on itself in a violent crisis. The war, she warned, was the method of capital accumulation by other, more brutal means. And so the call went out, not to defend freedom, but to defend the investments and the empires of the ruling class. Patriotic fervor, nationalism, was manufactured by the press, owned by the same industrialists who would profit from the endless demands for shells, rifles, and uniforms. The working men of Europe and beyond, who shared more in common with each other than with their factory-owning masters, were marched to the slaughter. They were told to fight for king and country, but in reality, they were fighting to decide whether German or British capital would dominate the iron fields of Alsace-Lorraine, the oil fields of the Middle East, and the riches of Africa.
One day we got orders to storm a French position. We got in, and my comrades fell right and left of me, but then I was confronted by a French corporal, he with his bayonet at the ready, and I with my bayonet at the ready. For a moment, I felt the fear of death. And in a fraction of a second, I realized that he was after my life exactly as I was after his. I was quicker than he was. I tossed his rifle away and I ran my bayonet through his chest. He fell, put his hand on the place where I had hit him, and then I thrust again. Blood came out of his mouth and he died. I felt physically ill. I nearly vomited. My knees were shaking and I was, quite frankly, ashamed of myself. My comrades, I was a corporal there then, and they were ordinary men like me. One of them was a tram conductor, another one a commercial traveler, two were students, the rest were farm workers, ordinary people who never would have thought to do any harm to anyone. How did it come about? I remembered then that we were told that the good soldier kills without thinking of his adversary as a human being. The very moment he sees in him a fellow man, he is not a good soldier anymore.
This was the great bloody secret of the war. It was an imperialist war, a colonial war, infighting amongst so-called white communities fought on European soil, the collapse of the white supremacist myth. And the empires brought their colonies with them. Millions of soldiers from India, Africa, Asia were all dragged into a white man's war, sent to die for an empire that denied them their own basic human rights. They were cannon fodder in a struggle to decide which set of white rulers would continue to exploit them. The war was not just a European white civil war, it was the violent apex of global colonialism. But in the midst of the carnage, a crack appeared in the machine. In 1917, the Russian people, soldiers and workers alike, had had enough. They turned their guns the other way. They overthrew the Tsar and then the provisional government that sought to continue the war. The Bolsheviks, under the slogan "Peace, Land, and Bread," understood the war for what it was, an imperialist butchery. They pulled Russia out of the conflict, exposing the lie that the war was one of national defense. This was the great fear of every ruling class, that the workers would see their common cause across national lines. The war ended in 1918. The machine had gorged itself on over 20 million lives. But it was not finished. The Treaty of Versailles did not dismantle the imperial system. It merely reshuffled the colonies, punishing Germany and creating the perfect conditions for a new, more dangerous poison to rise from the ashes, the poison of fascism. Fascism was not the opposite of the system that created the war, it was the monstrous offspring. When the working class threatened to revolt, as it did in Germany, Italy, Hungary, the capitalist elites made a pact with the devil. They funded and empowered violent, ultranationalist movements to crush the left, to break the unions, and to discipline the population. Fascism was capitalism in decay, donning a mask of national unity to preserve the power of property and industry. The war to end all wars did nothing of the sort. It was the opening act of a century-long crisis of capitalism and imperialist bloodletting that led directly to the even greater horrors of World War II. So when we remember the Great War, we must look past the poppies and the poetry. We must see it for what it was, a brutal, logical outcome of imperialism and the capitalist drive for profit above all else. It was a war where the working class and the colonized people of the world were the victims, and the only victors were the arms dealers, the industrialists, the ghosts of empires who sowed the wind and reaped a whirlwind that would haunt the entire 20th and indeed the 21st century. The trenches were not just a failure of diplomacy, they were the grave dug by the old world for itself.
But I had in front of me the dead men the dead French soldier, and how would I liked him to have raised his hand. I would have shaken his hand, and we would have been the best of friends, because he was like me, but a poor boy who had to fight, who had to go in with the most cruel weapons against a man who had nothing against him personally, who only wore the uniform of another nation, who spoke another language, but a man who had father and mother and a family perhaps, to fire at each other from a distance, to drop bombs is something impersonal. But to see each other's white in the eyes and then to run with a bayonet against a man, that was against my conception and against my inner feeling. But I felt that the culture we boasted so much about is only a very thin lacquer which chips off the very moment we come in contact with cruel things like real war.